Hey YouTube, what's up? Thanks for tuning in. You see a big mess here on my table, next servo test. But this is more a BEC or ESC test than a servo test. Maybe you've seen my videos of the servo tests when I tested 16 standard servos and in another video 4 small 25-gram servos. The results were extremely interesting, and I found that several servos throw a lot of amps and others do not, and some servos reach their specifications, others do not. However, I tested the servos using my lab power supply in the video of the 16 servo tests, which can deliver 5 amps, and in the test of the 25-gram servos I additionally limited the amp to 2 and 1 amps, so to be able to estimate how much the servos would be able to pull, how large or big the torque will be if you use an ESC with 2 or 1 amp BEC only. In the standard servos I also thought of doing this, limiting the amp draw to a maximum of 3 amps or 2 amps, because that's what most of the normal ESCs we use in our crawlers for brushed motors do have their BECs mostly specified to 3 amps or 2 amps. However, those tests were already very long, and I thought I will do this later. And then a buddy, Rollo123, Roland from German Rock Roller Forum, did the tests, the torque tests of the EuroAV WP26 servo, a really power-hungry servo which drew a lot of amps in my test, with the Hobbywing 1080 ESC, which should have a BEC which is limited to 3 amps or 6 amps, I don't know exactly. And he also tested 1 or 2 further servos, and he got really good results, so there was no difference. I guess he also tested the Power HD, and his results were consistent with my results, even if my servos drew more than 3 amps. And that made me think a little bit. It doesn't make a lot of sense to limit the amp draw to 3 or 2 amps if the ESCs or the BECs of the ESCs are maybe able to deliver more amps than their specifications say. And furthermore, I was not sure if my power supply, that's a super cheap lab power supply, if it shows the right values in amp draw. So I thought, okay, that's really super interesting, and I have a ton of different ESCs for our crawlers, and I searched all my ESCs and took them off the cars if they've been already in, and wanted to test the maximum torque the servos can deliver, and also check the amp draw with the different ESCs. And that's what I will do now, and I will check the amps using a multimeter, and additionally I will check the amp draw when using the lab power supply with the multimeter too, so to be able to check if the values the super cheap power supply shows are correct. And I can already tell you now the values are correct. So this multimeter is not a top multimeter, but it's an okay multimeter. It's about twice as expensive as the lab power supply, and you will see later the amps the power supply shows that are drawn are correct, verified by the multimeter. And so for those tests I will test a ton of different ESCs. You will see here only one of them I won't use for the tests with the large servos. And I thought, okay, it's also maybe interesting to check the voltage, if it's correct what the factory specifications say. And therefore I also checked the voltage with the multimeter. The first ESC is the Hobbywing 1625, the Hobbywing Quicrun 1625. It's a very small ESC with only 25 amps, but it's a really nice ESC for small cars. and its BEC is specified to 6 volts and 1 amp. And I checked the voltage, and that's correct. I measured 6.02 volts. However, this ESC is too weak, or the BEC of this ESC is too weak for the servos. It shuts off, so I won't use it later in the tests. The second ESC I will test is the super popular and cheap Hobbywing 1040 or Hobbywing Quicrun 1040. This rebranded comes in a lot of ready-to-run cars. Its BEC is specified to 2 amps and 6 volts, and I measured the voltage of the BEC, and I measured 6.03 volts, so that's totally fine. The next ESC I will test is the super popular Hobbywing Quicrun 1060. Many of us use cheap, really good ESC. Its BEC is specified to 3 amps and 6 volts, and I measured the voltage, and as you can see, 6.01 volts, so totally fine. The next ESC is probably the most popular Crawler ESC. Super cheap, not super cheap, but high value for the money, the Hobbywing 1080, and many of us use a lot of those ESCs in their trucks because they are such a good value for the money. And it has a BEC that's specified to 3 amps with a maximum of 6 amps and 6 volts and 7.4 volts. And I measured the voltage, and I measured 6.03 volts when it was set to a 6 volt BEC, and 7.37 volts when it was set to 7.4 volts, so totally fine. The next ESC I will test is also quite popular because it's so cheap and it's really quite okay, quite good for small crawlers. It's the Hobbyking X-Car 45 amp brushed ESC. You could get it sometimes when there was a sale for 5 euros. Normally it's 10 euros, and it really works fine. Its BEC is specified to 2 amps and 5.6 volts, and I measured the voltage, and as you can see, only 5.27 volts, so lower than specified. The next ESC I will test is a Racerstar 60 amp super cheap ESC. They are not always sold as Racerstar, sometimes only as brushed ESC 60 amps. You get them for about 10 bucks and sometimes promotions at 7 bucks or whatever. Its BEC is specified to only 2 amp and only 5 volt. And of course I measured the voltage of the BEC, and as you can see here, 5.27 volts, so the voltage is even higher than its specifications say. And the next ESC I will test is also super popular. That's the Tamiya TBLE-02S brushed brushless ESC. This comes in a lot of Tamiya kits, and you can use it for brushed and brushless motors, so it's really widespread. And I do have some of those, and they work fine in the Tamiya cars. I guess this one is from my CC01. Its BEC is specified to 6 volts and only 1.5 amps. And I measured the voltage, and 6.03 volts, as you can see, so totally fine. And the next ESC I will test, that's the only brushless ESC I do have for my trucks or 1 to 10th cars, I do have quite a lot for helis and planes and smaller cars, but not for 1 to 10th cars. That's the Hobbyking, also X-Car HK Sense 35 amps. That's a censored brushless 35 ampere ESC. I guess it's discontinued meanwhile. Of course, not a super huge ESC, and its BEC is specified to 2 amps and 6 volts. I measured the voltage, and as you can see, 6.03 volts, totally fine. And the last ESC I will test, that's the Surpass Hobby 60 amp Crawler ESC. That does also come in a lot of sets with the 5-slot 540 Surpass Hobby Crawler motors. It's a quite small ESC in size, and it has a big disadvantage. Its BEC is specified to 2 amps and only 7.4 volt. That was not announced in the beginning. So that's a high voltage BEC, and you cannot set it to 6 volt. So you will need a high voltage servo for this ESC. And I tested the voltage, and as you can see, 7.37 volts, so totally fine. And for those tests, I won't test all 16 large servos I tested in my previous tests. I took 2 of the servos that drew most of the amps. I will take this SPT 5435 LV180 servo, 35 kilogram servo. This was the strongest servo in my servo tests. However, it did not show a torque of 35, but more of 25 kilograms. And it also was the servo that drew most amps. So it was the most power hungry servo. In some single tests, it showed more than 4 amps. And the second servo was also a very power hungry servo, the Euro AV WP26. That's a high voltage servo, so I will test this servo on 6 volts and with the Surpass Hobby and the Hobbywing 1080 also on 7.4 volt. And it was also very power hungry, and we will see how this goes on now. In those tests I will show you the results of the 3 single measurements, but for comparing in the end I will use the mean of those 3 results. In my previous tests I used the best or highest result to compare it to the factory specifications. So I will test the servos now with all ESCs. Of course I won't test the 35 kilogram servos on 7.4 volts, so not on the Surpass Hobby ESC, and in the Hobbywing 1080 only with 6 volts. And you will see the results in kilogram centimeter, 1 centimeter, here on my luggage scale. And I will also show you the results in ounces inch, because some of you don't understand kilograms centimeter. And you can see the amp draw when I do the tests with the ESCs here on the multimeter, and when I do the tests with the LED power supply, you can compare the amp draw, the results or the values shown by the power supply and in the multimeter. And I also mounted 2 LEDs, 2 simple white LEDs here, and those will light up. And we will see if the lights are affected, if the servo is pulling with full force, because that's a problem many have. If you use a very strong servo and no additional external BEC, the lights are affected when you turn hard. I will show you a table now with the values of the voltage I measured, so that you can compare those, and then I will test the servos and their torque with this setup. And here you can see a summary of the voltage measurements of the BECs of the ESCs tested, and you see all of them were fine. The Hobbyking X-Car 45 amp ESC was the only one where the BEC put out significantly lower voltage than specified, and some, like the Racerstar 60 amp ESC, even had higher voltage than specifications said, or the Tamiya ESC. So quite fine all measurements, but the Hobbyking X-Car brushed ESC. The SPT 35 kg servo power supply, 6 volt, 5 amp maximum, 25 kilograms centimeter, nearly 360 ounces inch, 3.7 amps, and with a 3 amp limit, 6 volt, 24 kilograms centimeter, 331 ounces inch. And with 2 amp limit, 6 volt, 20 kilogram, 276 ounces inch. And with the Hobbywing 1040 ESC, the 35 kilogram servo, 24.6 kilograms centimeter, 342 ounces inch, and amp draw 3.5 amps. With the Hobbywing 1060 ESC, 25.7 kilograms centimeter, 357 ounces inch, and about 3.7 amps amp draw. With the Hobbywing 1080 at 6 volts, 25.5 kilograms centimeter, about 354 ounces inch, and 3.8 amps amp draw. With a small Hobbyking X-Car 45 amp ESC, about 20 kilograms centimeter, 275 ounces inch, and amp draw 2.8 amps. With a cheap Racerstar 60 amp ESC, 22.5 kilograms centimeter, 313 ounces inch, and about 3 amps amp draw. And with the Tamiya ESC, 25.5 kilograms, 354 ounces inch, and amp draw 3.7 amps. The brushless sensored Hobbyking 35 amp ESC, 23.5 kilograms centimeter, about 326 ounces inch, and 3.4 amps. The Euro AV WP26 power supply, 6 volt, 5 amp, 18 kilogram centimeter, 255 ounces inch, and 3.2 amps, and amp draw limited to 3 amps, 18.8 kilograms, 261 ounces inch. And the power supply limited to 2 amps, 14.2 kilograms centimeter, and about 197 ounces inch. And now high voltage, 7.4 volt, 5 amp, power supply, 19.2 kilograms centimeter, about 267 ounces inch, and 3.8 amps. High voltage, power supply, 3 amp limit, about 18 kilograms centimeter, and about 250 ounces inch. And the WP26 high voltage limit 2 amps, about 15.7 kilograms centimeter and 218 ounces inch. WP26 with the Hobbywing Quicrun 1040, about 17.3 kilograms, 241 ounces inch and 2.9 amps amp draw. With the Hobbywing 1060, 17.3 kilograms centimeter, 240 ounces inch and 3 amps amp draw. WP26 with the Hobbywing 1080 with 6 volts, 17.3 kilograms, 241 ounces inch and 3 amps amp draw. And now high voltage, 7.4 volt Hobbywing 1080 WP26, 18.3 kilograms centimeter, 254 ounces inch and 3.2 amps amp draw. With the Hobbyking X-Car 45 amp ESC, 14.5 kilograms centimeter, 202 ounces inch and 2.3 amps amp draw. With a cheap Racerstar 60 amp ESC, 16.1 kilograms centimeter, about 224 ounces inch and 2.6 amps draw. With a Tamiya ESC, 17 kilograms centimeter, 237 ounces inch and 2.9 amps amp draw, specified to 1.5 amps. And with a censored brushless Hobbyking 35 amp ESC, 17 kilograms centimeter, about 237.5 ounces inch and 2.8 amps. With the Surpass Hobby A Crawler ESC high voltage, you can see here that the servo is shuddering so weak, 70.8 kilograms centimeter, 247 ounces inch and 2.7 amps. So servo tests finished, and I will show you the results and compare the results in some tables and graphs now. And here you can see the results of the SPT 35 kilogram servo in a graph with bars. On the left side the torque in ounces inch and kilograms centimeter, and on the right side the amp draw. The bars show the mean values of the 3 single measurements. The dotted lines show 25 kilograms and the 2 and 3 amp limit, and the lights should indicate if the LED was affected. 5 steps, only 4 steps shown here, fully yellow, no effect, little bit lighter yellow, very slight effect, effect and strong effect. And what you can see here, that there are 4 ESCs that give the same torque results as the 5 amp power supply delivered. All 3 Hobbywing ESCs, and surprisingly the Tamiya TBLE-02S ESC. So there is nearly no difference to the 5 amp power supply, while the results, if I limited the amps of the power supply to 3 and 2 amp maximum, are significantly lower, so the torque is much lower than with full amp draw. So even with this super power hungry 35 kilogram servos, no problem for the Tamiya and the Hobbywing ESCs. So external BEC should not be necessary. This is a big surprise for me. And the biggest surprise is the Tamiya BEC or the Tamiya ESC could deliver more than 3.5 amps. So that's a big surprise because it's specified for 1.5 amps only. And here you can see the same results in a table with the results of all single measurements and the mean. And on the right side you see also the factory specifications of the BEC, how many amps it should be able to deliver. And if you go to the bottom, you see the Tamiya ESC, its BEC should be able to deliver 1.5 amps, and it delivered in the 3 tests a mean of 3.7 amps. Wow. If you're interested in the results of each single measurement, those are the small numbers. You can stop the video now and check if you're really interested. And standard deviation and standard error, that's a running joke, forget it. If you take a look at the single results of each single measurement, you will see that those were surprisingly consistent, extremely consistent, even more consistent than in my first servo tests, I think. And here you can see the results of the Euro AV WP26 servo. Again, the bars show the mean values of the 3 single measurements. The lights show if the LED was affected or not, and I did test this servo not only with 6 volts but also with 7.4 volts. So I also did test the Surpass Hobby 60 amp ESC, which has a high voltage 7.4 volt BEC, and I tested the Hobbywing 1080 also with 7.4 volt. And what you can see, lights were hardly affected. Only the Surpass Hobby 60 amp ESC does seem to have a very weak BEC. At least the LED lights were significantly affected during the torque tests, while in all other ESCs in the tests the LEDs were slightly or not affected. What you also can see, there is not a huge difference between high voltage and 6 volt torque. There is a little bit of difference, but not that much. And what's also a surprise, that at 7.4 volts the servo draws more amps than at 6 volts. Normally you would say higher voltage, lower amp draw, but that's not the fact. And here you can see all single results of all measurements of the Euro AV WP26 in the table again, if you are interested in this. Of course, again, with standard error, standard deviation, and with the factory specifications of the amp draw. And you see again that all BECs, all ESCs, the BECs of all ESCs delivered significantly more amp than their factory specifications said. Even if the Euro AV WP26 should draw quite a lot of amp, nearly all of the ESCs should be able to handle this servo. Only the Hobbyking X-Car 45 amp brushed ESC is probably a little bit too weak. Even the Racerstar 60 amp ESC is super cheap. It should work with this servo, so that's a big positive surprise for me. It's not necessary to use external BECs even with this strong or strong and amp hungry full metal servo. So that's it, guys. Finish. Really positive surprise. All ESCs are stronger or can deliver more amps than their specifications say, and even for those power hungry servos you do not necessarily need a super strong BEC or any external BEC. The WP26 you can use with nearly all of those ESCs, maybe not the small Hobbyking, and even the SPT 35 kilogram servo will work fine with a lot of ESCs. The winners are clearly the Hobbywing 1080. Of course, everyone expected this. That's a super top ESC. But also the Hobbywing 1060, super nice. And even the 1040, the super cheap 1040, has a really strong BEC. But the biggest surprise for sure was the Tamiya ESC, specified to 1.5 amps and delivered a lot more. And there were only few disappointments. The biggest disappointment for sure, the 60 amp Crawler ESC with the high voltage BEC, the Surpass Hobby one. All the others are fine, and that you shouldn't use a 25 amp tiny ESC for big servos, I guess that's not a big surprise. So you didn't see any tests because it shut down. I guess those were really interesting results, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks for watching. I'll be back.